I want to look at the European counter-proposal for Ukraine quite seriously, because for once it's not merely a mood but a text, and it's meant to do three things at once: rescue Ukraine from a bad bargain, rescue Europe from strategic irrelevance, and rescue the Americans from their own haste. Starting with the atmosphere, the Trump White House drops its 28-point plan on Friday, in effect saying to Kyiv, sign by Thanksgiving or fight your little heart out and we won't help. The language is as affectionate as a casino bouncer. Europe and Ukraine have responded by pouncing on that and producing a rival plan in Geneva that treats the American draft as a rough worksheet, then writes no in red ink in the margins. What is Europe objecting to? Not the idea of peace, but the idea of peace as surrender disguised as realism. The US draft, co-written with Russian input, asks Ukraine to cede substantial territory, shrink its army to 600,000 and accept a ban on joining NATO. It also effectively blocks friendly foreign forces on Ukrainian soil. That combination would leave Ukraine alive but defenseless, a state that exists on paper while its security is outsourced to Putin's good manners. Europe is not buying that. So what does the European text actually do? First, it reasserts sovereignty as a starting axiom. Point 1 is not ornamental. Ukraine's sovereignty to be reconfirmed signals that any settlement begins with the premise that Ukraine is not a bargaining chip but a subject of law. This may sound obvious, but it is precisely what the American draft muddied by entertaining territorial transfers before a ceasefire and by flirting with the logic of might makes borders. Second, Europe deletes the most brazen pro-Russian line. The US plan had a point implying NATO should not expand further and that Russia should reciprocate by not invading neighbours. Europe strikes that clause out entirely. This matters because it refuses to write Moscow's veto into the architecture of Europe. If you reward invasion with an alliance moratorium, you teach every revisionist power the same trick. Third, it tackles the army cap in a way that is both practical and symbolic. Trump proposes 600,000, Europe says 800,000 in peacetime. 200,000 soldiers is not a rounding error. It's the difference between a deterrent that can man a long frontier and one that cannot. Even at 800,000, Ukraine would be trimming slightly from its current mobilization, but it would still remain capable of defending itself if Russia decides that treaties are seasonal. Fourth, on NATO membership, Europe performs a neat verbal judo move. It doesn't promise Ukraine entry tomorrow. It says that entry depends on NATO consensus and notes that such consensus does not presently exist. That keeps the door open without pretending it's already unlocked. Crucially, it denies Moscow a formal ban. The difference between not now and never is the difference between diplomacy and capitulation. Fifth, foreign forces. The European plan says NATO will not permanently station troops under its command in Ukraine in peacetime. That is a concession to Russian sensitivities, but it is not a blanket ban on friendly forces, and it sits alongside the broader European insistence that Ukraine not be forced into neutrality. In other words, Ukraine keeps agency over its security partnerships, even if they must be carefully framed. Sixth, ceasefire sequencing. Europe demands a ceasefire across the current line of contact before serious territorial bargaining begins, and future swaps are to be negotiated from that line, not from Russian maximalist claims. That is not sentimentalism, it is bargaining 101. You do not negotiate a house sale while the buyer is still setting fire to the kitchen. Stop the shooting, then talk about the fence. Seventh, sanctions and enforcement. Europe accepts a gradual easing of sanctions, but only if Russia complies, and with a snap-back mechanism if it cheats. The US draft is more indulgent, imagining long-term US business deals and rapid reintegration. Europe's version is blunt: no good behaviour, no rewards. This is how deterrence works. You do not hand out the cake before the child has stopped throwing the plate. Eighth, reconstruction and assets. Here, Europe is quietly revolutionary. It insists Ukraine be reconstructed and compensated using frozen Russian sovereign assets which remain frozen until compensation is paid. The US draft entertains diverting a portion of these assets into American investment schemes. Europe says no, the aggressor pays the bill. That is consistent with both justice and the basic moral grammar of war. Ninth, the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant and other infrastructure. The European text proposes restarting Zaporizhzhia under the IAEA supervision, with power shared 50-50 between Russia and Ukraine, and restoring Ukraine's control of key sites such as the plant and the Kakhovka Dam, plus unhindered river access. This is a classic European move: turn a military problem into a monitored technocratic arrangement and remove a major blackmail lever from Moscow's hand. 10th, the humanitarian spine. The plan commits to all-for-all exchanges of prisoners and bodies, return of detainees and abducted children, and family reunification. This is not a sentimental add-on. It is the only way a settlement becomes socially durable, rather than a cold truce that curdles into revenge politics. Now, why does all this matter beyond the page? Because Europe is trying to reinsert itself into a negotiation that Washington and Moscow attempted to stage as a duet. Ursula von der Leyen has been explicit that Europe must be central to any settlement, and Merz is already signalling scepticism about Trump's Thursday deadline. The counter-proposal is Europe saying, we are at the table, not on the menu. And there's also a deeper strategic contest here about what kind of peace ends wars. Trump's plan is peace as transaction, land for silence, numbers for headlines, a Nobel pitch wrapped in a spreadsheet. Europe's plan is peace as restraint, enforceable guarantees, credible deterrence, and a refusal to reward conquest. Neither guarantees success, but only one avoids baking the next war into the settlement. And what of Trump's tantrum about gratitude? Zelensky has thanked the United States repeatedly, and European governments have noticed the old Trump reflex: when a deal wobbles, blame the victim for not applauding loudly enough. The European text is partly a diplomatic umbrella for Kyiv, allowing Ukraine to say yes to peace talks without saying yes to humiliation. My own judgment, for what it's worth, is that Europe has done the right thing in substance and in timing. Substantively, because the plan restores the logic that aggression mustn't pay. Timing-wise, because Trump's opening bid was always likely to be a maximalist anchor meant to drag negotiations towards Moscow's preferences. Counter-anchoring with a coherent text is exactly how you stop that drift. So where does this leave Geneva? With an unusually clear map of the argument. Washington says peace now, on terms that Russia can live with. Europe says peace soon, on terms Ukraine can live with. The next few days will show whether Trump wants a settlement or simply a spectacle. If he wants the former, he now has a serious document to work from. If he wants the latter, he will call it ingratitude and go shopping for another headline. Either way, Europe has stopped being a bystander, and that alone is change worth marking.